Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. And Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're proud to present tonight's event with our friends from Agnes College. We welcome Elizabeth Bronwyn Boyd in conversation with Mary Cain for a discussion of Southern beauty, race, ritual, and memory in the modern South. Southern beauty explains a curiosity, why a feminine ideal rooted in the 19th century continues to enjoy currency well into the 21st. Elizabeth Bronwyn Boyd examines how the continuation of certain gender rituals in the American South has served to perpetuate racism, classism, and sexism. This event is in partnership with the Agnes College Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. So our conversation partner is Dr. Mary Cain, who is the Associate Professor of History at Agnes College. She's the author of several articles and reviews that consider issues of race, gender, privilege, power, and domesticity in the antebellum United States. Her teaching interests include African American history, the history of slavery, Native American history, and U.S. women's history. In recent years, she has received both the Faith Yao Yu Chow Faculty Excellence Award and the Vulcan Materials Company Teaching Excellence Award. She was appointed editor of the teaching network within HNet, the online platform for the humanities and social studies, and social sciences, and looks forward to serving the academic community in that role. And the person of the hour tonight is Dr. Elizabeth Boyd, who's an interdisciplinary scholar whose experience growing up in Jackson, Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement and its aftermath inspired her to study, teach, and write about the U.S. South. Her research explores the gender performance of race and region. She holds a BA in Journalism, Broadcasting, and Film from Trinity University, an MA in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi, and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. She has served on the faculties of Vanderbilt University, the University of Mississippi, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and as a postdoctoral fellow at Illinois Program for Research in the Humanities, and as a visiting fellow at the Humanities Research Center, Australian National University. She is past president of the Kentucky-Tennessee American Studies Association and the Chesapeake American Studies Association. Her work has appeared in Washington Post, the New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, Chick Lit, the New Women's Fiction, and Southern Cultures. Her book that we are celebrating tonight, Southern Beauty, was published by the University of Georgia Press, and she currently lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland. So welcome to both of you, and welcome to everybody who's here with us in the room and also virtually watching from around the world. We are very glad to have all of you here. For folks who are watching virtually, know that you can ask questions at any time. And for our friends who are physically here with us, we will save some time for questions at the end, and I'll bring a microphone around. Even though it may feel silly to use a microphone in a room of this size, it is for accessibility and so that everybody can hear you, our virtual friends and our in-person friends. So I'll be man away and I'll bring it to you. And so without further ado, I'm gonna pass it over to Mary Cain. Let's get on with this wonderful conversation. Thank you to you both.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to echo ER in welcoming everyone who's here and our friends online. And thank you to Elizabeth Boyd for coming all the way to Atlanta to talk about your work.
Thank you for having me. Thanks to Agnes Scott and to Charis.
So your book addresses some very broad, important, and timely topics, including gender, race, and regional identity. Your protagonists are young white Southern women, a particular kind of young white Southern woman who you talk about as being the Southern beauty, the Southern belle, turning into the Southern lady. Can you start by telling us who these women are and how and why you chose to study them?
Yes. So I talk about the Southern beauty as sort of the legacy figure of the Southern belle and the Southern lady, sort of fused together in the popular imagination in contemporary times. These are young white Southern women who participate in a variety of popular rituals, and that is the sort of structure of my book. They are mostly middle class or middle to upper middle class. And they identify as they have a strong sense of Southern identity.
And how and why did you choose to study them?
Yeah, so, you know, I grew up in Jackson, as ER mentioned, and so this was very familiar territory to me. I had been away in Texas for a number of years and had come back to the University of Mississippi to work on a master's degree in Southern Studies. And I was sort of hit by this wall of competitive femininity. And it was so extreme and so sort of in your face all the time in these different productions. And part of me thought, well, I should be used to this. I remember this. But part of me was also thinking, you know, what exactly is going on here? Because some of the performances seemed a little bit retrograde. They seem to be a little bit of a throwback type of way of fashioning yourself for these particular rituals. And just to give you an understanding, I look in the book at 3 rituals: sorority rush, beauty pageants, and the Confederate pageant of the Natchez pilgrimage, which is part of their spring home and garden tour, in which this was a sort of an auxiliary to the actual home and garden tour, in which practically the entire white population of the town played these roles in a very Moonlight and Magnolias sort of Southern production that painted the Southern past, the white Southern past, as romantic and benevolent and just full of garden parties, and it was a constant leisure time. And that production did not change very much over the decades. So part of me, and also at the time, scholars were looking at whiteness and why was Southern identity sort of segregated? Why was it constantly coded as white? And I kept thinking, what do these young women have to do with this? And I wasn't quite sure I didn't know what I was going to argue, but I was very intrigued by it. And so I wanted to find out what they were doing in addition to choosing new members or choosing a representative of a beauty pageant. Was there something else in addition going on? And so I decided to explore this and to include interviews with the participants as part of my research method, because I felt like I could come up with one interpretation just by observing these productions, but I really wanted to know about their motivations and what was their experience like? Why did they do it? What did they get out of it?
Great. You mentioned the chapter on Natchez, and your other chapters draw heavily on your experiences in Mississippi and Alabama, but I couldn't help but notice that you open your book with an anecdote from Georgia.
I do.
And we are in Atlanta. It's a relatively recent anecdote, and
It is.
I wonder if maybe you can read the first little bit of your book to us to set the stage.
I'd be happy to. This is the beginning of my book, of the introduction, which is called Power Play. The decision was widely denounced as over the top after University of Oklahoma members of Sigma Alpha Epsilon, a fraternity with Southern roots, were caught on video in 2015 chanting a racist song with references to lynching. Greek leaders and campus officials at the University of Georgia announced a prohibition of hoop skirts. The reaction of many white UGA students and onlookers ranged from irritation to disbelief. The costume of choice for such campus events is Kappa Alpha's Old South Week and SAE's Magnolia Ball had nothing to do with racial intolerance, critics claimed. It was just fashion. And the crinoline embargo was yet another kowtow to political correctness Contemplating attendance at such events without their sartorial standby, the legions wondered aloud, what did the hoop have to do with the hate? But at least one UGA administrator understood all too well the ability of Southern symbols to suggest and even celebrate structures of inequality. Relegating the hoop skirt to mothballs required only a single meeting with Greek student leaders who, concerned with inviting negative attention, came to agree that such attire was, quote unquote, not appropriate in the context of some events. If there was dissension among their ranks, their silence concealed it. Ironically, the same campus leaders who brokered the ban limited its impact by quelling discussion of their decision. After a flash of national publicity, the story failed to gain traction, and other schools did not rush to enact similar prescriptions. Choosing silence over discussion, campus leaders shut down a potent symbol at UGA, but made no call for its curtailment elsewhere. In the end, the episode was a testament to the continuing power of Southern symbols, but also to the power of silence.
So right from the beginning, you introduced the hoop skirt, the presentation of the Southern beauty, but also the theme of silence. And I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about silence and the role of silence in your story. Why so much silence?
Yes, well, silence really has a storied past throughout Southern history, and it plays this important role in the segregated South, and in antebellum days. Silence was critical to maintaining the social sort of compact, because this white woman, the Southern lady, was this symbolic figure on which the entire hierarchy of race and class, the structure depended. She was supposed to be on this pedestal. She was beautiful. She was silent. She was demure, and she was kept in place because she was supposed to be threatened by supposedly bestial black men, right? So she couldn't really argue against that. And other people didn't speak up and argue because the whole logic, the whole cultural logic, if you interrogated it, it falls apart. There's no natural race hierarchy, and the Southern woman is not really in danger of anything. But this is how she maintains her privilege, both her race privilege and her class privilege. So she doesn't speak up, and it's not discussed. In fact, even in the Jim Crow South, the etiquette of Jim Crow is largely not discussed. It's learned, for sure. It's learned in all sorts of scenes of instruction. But part of what keeps the etiquette of Jim Crow working is that you don't talk about it. You know how it operates. You know what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do, both whites and blacks, children and adults, and certainly women. To speak out against it is to blow the cover on the whole thing.
I often tell my students that we learn a lot from silences, and paying attention to what's not said is as important as paying attention to what is said. The challenge is that studying silence is difficult. It's hard to excavate a silence. So I want to ask you about your method. Can you tell us how you did your research for this book?
Well, certainly, and I didn't go looking for silences. I think that that interpretation came to me after I was drafting the book. I mean, there were a few things that were more obvious when I talk about the silence of some of these. The beauty queen obviously is made to be seen and not heard, right? Sometimes she's even in an isolation booth But these other discursive silences really came to me when I was, after the fact of interpreting it, and I had written large passages of it, and I thought about how there were these literal silences in which these women in the performances were, again, it was all about image and production, but they weren't really supposed to be saying anything of significance. But then there were also these discursive silences where these women in these productions were sort of, in these spectacles that can seem bizarre on their face, and yet no one discussed that because they were playing important roles within white Southern culture. So to discuss it, there was a lot of, not seeing and not knowing, sort of blissful ignorance. And part of that was not discussing.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that you did a number of interviews for this project.
Yeah.
And you, in the book, you allude to your own observations about sorority rush and some of these other events. Can you share with us some of how you did that part of your work?
Sure. So I was, when I started this, I was living in Oxford, Mississippi, and I started with the sororities first, and quickly added in some pageant work, which I had actually done some of that earlier when I lived in Austin. But you don't just drop by a sorority party and expect to pop in. Because these are highly structured, this whole system of what they now call recruitment. So I had to have permission, up front from Greek life, as well as from the young women themselves. And I was paired with a rush group, and I would go around, and I actually went behind the scenes in all three of these productions. So I've seen all of the skits and all of the parties and all of the rounds. And then which I don't think people would actually let me do today. I think it's become more secretive or worried about exposure. But in terms of the interviews, a friend of mine said, well, what students understand is a sign-up sheet. Just get a sign-up sheet and sign them up. So I thought, well, that seems so obvious. So I went to some chapter meetings, and at that time I didn't know exactly what I was studying. And I said, I'm interested in femininity in the American South. That's about all I knew at that point. And I said, I'd love to do some interviews so you can tell me about your experience with Rush. And so people, opted in. They were self-identified, and they referred their friends. And so they were definitely self-selected, but it sort of snowballed from there.
Any memorable conversations you had with them or particular insights that you could not have gotten any other way?
Well, yes. Without being a member of one of those clubs, I don't think I would have understood the intricacies of the mechanics of the rush parties, where they do some particular methods of wooing the girls without the rush-y understanding exactly what's going on. They bump each other, they go bumping, and they move, from point A to point B, and then these other people are going to surround this one girl that they all really want. And so it's actually incredibly, the advanced planning is very intricate and specific. And so that was kind of fascinating. But I also talked with girls that had a lot of ambivalence about being in such exclusive clubs. Some of them talked to me about, in sort of guarded manners, about regretting that they were so racially exclusive. Some of them talked about their parental and family expectations and peer pressure that was part and parcel of the whole process. So it was, they told me lots.
Maybe you can read another section from your book. I'm thinking of the passage on memory and race, starting on page 9, which I think really sets up your argument.
Sure. Black and white Southerners in the modern South shared a common history, but they often remembered it in such drastically different ways that racial reconciliation remained elusive. Black Southerners understood the end of the Civil War in unmistakable terms of freedom, liberation, and jubilee. They recognized emancipation as a watershed moment in a long arc of progress, a milestone in an unfinished quest for equality. Many white Southerners, though, could only look back on this same moment with a sense of loss and defeat. For every progressive white Southerner with a sense of historical consciousness, for whom regional identity was located in collectively remembered crucibles of racial reckoning and transformative change, was another, for whom family and community memories got in the way, for whom time-honored tales of Confederate bravery, honor, and loss crowded the mind and competed for the heart. More complicated still were those whose allegiances were continually tugged in both directions. For them, white Southerners was a persistent paradox, a simultaneous source of solace and pride, discomfort and regret. Writers had called for Southerners of all races to recognize the commonalities of their experience. Only by viewing the past through a shared lens of tragedy would Southerners, black and white, see themselves in each other. Only by acknowledging that their future together is inextricable from their ability to share the past could Southerners hope to create a regional identity of common definition. But for white Southerners brought up on cherished myths and oft-told tales, revising or enlarging the racial boundaries of regional identity threatened all touchstones of self. When family stories were inextricable from regional myths, calls to question and revise collective understandings of the Southern past shook the very foundations of identity. If the past is essential for one's identity, writes David Goldfield, then renouncing, forgetting, or ignoring the past shatters the self. For many decades, the result was a confederacy of silence, a tacit agreement, equal parts etiquette, obstinacy, and shame. It was a pact shattered by the murders in Charleston. Yet, even as remorseful white Southerners breathed a sigh of relief and joined the push for changes to the nation's commemorative culture, others resolutely pushed back. The initial surge to remove Confederate symbols from civic spaces was soon met by backlash and litigation. The fierce resistance fit a familiar pattern. Eras of African-American progress and moments of Black agencies have always prompted a racist backlash, and the age of Black Lives Matter and the first Black presidency was no different. Opposition to retiring Confederate symbols joined discriminatory legislation in Mississippi and North Carolina targeting transgender persons, state laws designed to prevent minority voting, the celebration of Confederate Heritage Month in 7 states, and the misogynistic and xenophobic presidential candidacy of Donald Trump to produce a political climate one national magazine dubbed Confederate Spring. The following November, Trump would prevail by appealing to alienated white voters, including men plagued by aggrieved entitlement, the sense that the unearned economic, political, and cultural privileges white men had enjoyed for centuries were under attack by minorities, women, and immigrants. White identity politics clearly resonated with a wide swath of the US electorate, but they did nothing less than embolden white nationalists. On August 12, 2017, 200 self-proclaimed white supremacists descended on Charlottesville, Virginia, in response to city officials' plans to remove a bronze statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from a downtown park. Marching through the University of Virginia campus, these Unite the Right protesters chanted, "Our blood, our soil," and "Jews will not replace us." By the end of the day, marked by violent skirmishes, 19 counter-protesters had been injured, and anti-racist activist Heather Heyer was dead. For anyone needing proof that the Charleston massacre had been no fluke, the fatal violence in Charlottesville provided it. Yet, even as raucous and violent protests against dismantling monuments and retiring flags drew headlines, quieter symbols of white Southernness carried on unabated. Where less is spoken, more is performed. For every contested Southern landscape was another that continued to serve as a stage for acts of region too violent for words, not too volatile for words. In ritual gender performances and routine feminine gestures, young white women continued to make the racial claims of region that could no longer be spoken.
Thank you. So where less is spoken, more is performed. And from there, you get into the various performances of these Southern beauties. Can you talk a little bit about why, for example, sorority rush at these white sororities, why beauty pageants took on this powerful role in constructing white Southern identity?
Yeah, well, so, you know, in the antebellum South, and in the antebellum South, sororities started in the slave South, in Georgia, actually, at Wesleyan. And some scholars have said it's sort of not surprising that this would have happened because this was a culture concerned with hierarchy, right? And so the sororities started because the young women had been excluded from men's literary conversation clubs. So they started their own, but they quickly became sort of replicated the process of identifying themselves in contradistinction to non-members. So there was an exclusion process even then. But in the post-war South, women were central to memory making. And that's really the analytical structure that my book uses, is looking at these productions and these young women as these focal points for white Southern nostalgia as we move through the decades. But, in the Reconstruction era, it was the United Daughters of the Confederacy that frequently had, they worked so hard and were so successful, of course, creating this commemorative culture that we're just now starting to dismantle. But young women were part and parcel of all of those productions of the monument unveilings and the Confederate veteran celebrations that they would have. There would usually be they would have a ceremony and have a young white woman dressed in white, always very virginal looking, as this held up at the end as this symbol of the white South lost, right? And so what happens is about the time that those last Confederate veterans finally die off, this symbol has to go somewhere. And there's still this sentiment of the white woman, the beauty, as a regional symbol of white Southernness. And so she moves from this pedestal to pageantry, to more commercial, more public, to these performances, rather than these strictly Confederate memorial productions. And so that's where that's sort of the beginning of that, and that happens about the same time that the Miss America pageant forms, 1921. It's really about that time period. And so the South already had this active this belief in this symbol as a symbol of region. And they also had a pretty robust system of harvest festivals where there would usually be a queen. I'm thinking especially a little bit, 20s, 30s. And so they were sort of primed to move to the front of the Miss America pageant, is the system that I study the most, to be sort of in the forefront.
So you've written a lot, now you've spoken about the many performances that these white women undertook. What do we know, what do you know about their thoughts and their feelings about all of this? What are they thinking while they are engaged in these rituals?
Um,
Are they aware that they are these symbols?
Well, I think some are and some aren't. I think, and let me be clear, and I say this in the book, you don't have to be intentionally racist to be part of a racist structure that, that has that effect. But many of them, thinking about the sororities, there's a goal for social success, and there's also some precedent usually within their family. They've been assuming that they would do this their whole life, a lot of them. So there's even the ones that are reluctant or with some misgivings. Now, of course, I didn't talk to the ones who drop out of Rush or are cut out of Rush, but there is more continuity than bucking the system.
Speaking of Rush, which is a very college tradition on some campuses, I'm thinking about our location here at Charis. We are on the campus of Agnes College, which I think in 2023 is a very different kind of place than some of the universities that you've studied. And I'm attracted to the way you write about the college as a locus of identity formation for the South. And you have a passage, thinking on page 82, 81, 82, about the college campus and its creation of Southern identity, if you would share that with us.
Sure. So this is looking at what is an important follow-on to the earlier time period I was just mentioning about post UDC. And this is looking, thinking about the mid-20th century South when racial desegregation is on the horizon, but there is massive resistance. With massive resistance brewing at the distance, Southern collegians like those at Alabama continually place the ideal Southern beauty front and center of white campus culture. A more persuasive political symbol did not exist. She embodied exactly what was at stake for white Southerners resistant to racial equality. At the intersection of romance, regional pride, and embattled entitlement, the political and the popular joined together, harnessing the power of gender to serve the needs of white supremacy. Massive resistance and passive resistance fed off each other, solidifying Southern whiteness. Stories of Southern universities as sites of racial crisis and massive resistance, including the angry mob that greeted authoring Lucy when she attempted to desegregate the University of Alabama in 1956, and the deadly riot sparked by James Meredith's integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962, would become touchstones of civil rights history. Numerous writers would explore the campuses as incubators of conservative, masculine political power. But acknowledgement of Southern beauty as a significant form of passive resistance and the role of campus culture in reproducing her would take much longer, despite the fact that white Southern collegians perhaps most routinely and consistently celebrated their, quote, Southern way of life in prominent, predictable rituals of feminine beauty.
Thank you. I think anyone who has studied the civil rights struggle understands why the universities were such an important location of this work in that era. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how and why the college or university continues to be such an important location for white identity construction.
Yeah, so I think the thing that keeps it going are a couple of things. One is that all of these rituals are essentially coming of age rites, you know, with somewhere within that late teen to early 20s time period. Even Miss America contestants, they age out at, I think, 23. And so these are sort of crucial vehicles for launching yourself socially within this culture. And college campuses are where these Southern beauties are, right, at that time period in their lives. So there's a lot of expectation that this will be an important 4 years of sort of cementing or solidifying your social place. And it's kind of it's a crucial time period.
Yeah, and I guess there's a class element as well, right? Because we're talking about young people from families who could send them to college.
That's right. That's right. And then also, the Greek system has gotten extremely expensive, especially on some campuses. So that is, there's a real wealth factor. Beauty pageants, for as much as they like to tell these stories about how, you know, one of the apologies that they always make is that, oh, I was doing it for the scholarship. And it really doesn't add up beyond the sort of lower levels of pageantry. If you are competing at the state level and you're going to Miss Georgia or whatever, you are laying out so much more money than you would ever recoup unless you're the very top winner, that argument really doesn't wash. But it's still told all the time. Yeah. So that's expensive. Although pageantry is also all class levels participate in that, but it gets more expensive as you move up. The Natchez pilgrimage, of course, is already an elite group of families where lineage is actually much more important to your participation in the Natchez pageant. It's more important than your physical beauty. But on the other hand, that pageant most explicitly, besides these Old South and Dixie Week productions that I talked about in the first reading, they most explicitly call on that figure of they literally are dressed up as the Southern Belle and the Southern Lady in these productions. So they trade on that image overtly.
I'm wondering if we can think about this phenomenon of the Southern beauty from the perspective of Southerners who were not white, and what you learned about their experiences. I'm also thinking about one of the anecdotes that I found fascinating in your book was the story of Kimberly Dandridge and her experience in the rush system at Ole Miss. Can you talk maybe about her and about how Black Southerners intersect with this beauty culture of white womanhood?
Yeah, so now I will say I did not study Black sororities because that was, my question was about what were white women doing. But of course, this issue of the sororities desegregating in some token fashion, but not until the 2010
So recent.
and 2013, I believe, at the University of Alabama, which I also go into in my book. So Kimberly Dandridge was, you know, a top student. She was from Como, Mississippi, and she was, you know, accomplished and a good student and cute and all the things you need to be. And she had somehow, the previous year, she had been cut out of the black sorority intake system on a technicality, something she didn't get right with her paperwork. And some white friends in these different other clubs had convinced her to rush in the mainline white sorority system the following year. And so that sort of made her black friends pretty disgruntled that she was going to go do this. And then she found herself, even though she'd been encouraged to rush with these white groups, cut out in the very first or one or two rounds from all but one club. And she ultimately did pledge Phi Mu, and she said she experienced racism in her own house, just personal racism from members who were not prepared to have a black woman as their sister. But she, you know, she said, I wish there wasn't a black system and a white system. I wish we just had one system, right? And the reason that she was successful pledging in Phi Mu came down to their standards for membership, which was a simple majority. So other clubs that had blackballing, in which one no could mean, you know, forget it, you're out, did not hold in that case. And so it's not surprising, actually, that Phi Mu would be one of the first.
And 2010, I mean, again, so recent.
Yeah. Well, so let me just say something else about that. I mean, this is another silence, right? And it's a silence on the part of university administrators, because this was like an open secret, but again, something that was not discussed. And there, in terms of, well, who is in the clubs? Oh, well, they just don't track race. They don't track who's in the clubs, because those are private clubs. And yet they, you know, university administrators, they track everything. This was a choice not to track. And this is at a time when many Greek clubs, of course, had these sweetheart deals of leases for $1 a year on these giant faux antebellum mansions that are their chapter houses. And so it was very much hand in glove with the administration and alumni that drug their heels on desegregating these clubs, long past even fraternities. It was like women were going to be the final bastion of segregation in this case. And there was a lot of sentiment of literally, you know, that sort of idea about pure blood. There are all these familial terms with sorority houses about your sisters, who just could not fathom having a black sister. So, but the silence on the part of the administration, and in fact, it was only broken. I don't know exactly how it went down at Phi Mu, but at the University of Alabama, there were instances of adult alumni who influenced the voting process and had actually withdrawn African American candidates' names from consideration before anybody got to vote on them at all. And the only reason that this came to a head was the students who finally said, aren't we ever even going to talk about the black girl? And so they broke the silence, and student journalists at the University of Alabama broke the silence. And so really, the administrators only pushed for a change after they were publicly shamed.
So are things changing?
Well, not fast enough, Mary.
You know, are sororities and pageants and pilgrimages still in 2023 playing this role?
Well, they are. I think they are. There has been some change, but I don't think that these clubs will ever, at least in my lifetime, they're not going to resemble their state's demographics, right? As I said in the book, these are clubs they're used to having the daughters of cotton planters, not cotton pickers, right? So it's a real class thing, but it's a race thing as well. And in the case of the Natchez pageant, they actually have finally started grappling with that production a few years ago, just a few years ago, like 4 years ago. A young woman was put forward to be queen of the Natchez pilgrimage, and she told her father, who's kind of a well-known novelist, Daddy, I am not doing that unless somebody rewrites that script. And so he did. And for the first time, they had, there was a depiction of enslavement. There were Black people on stage again. There had been very early in the production, but that had dropped away. And importantly, they, at the end, admitted that the South had lost. But and they did that for a couple of years, followed by another sort of progressive revision of that script. But ultimately, it turns out that having slavery on stage was kind of a bummer, and people were not coming. And so now they're back at they've retreated into pretty much their old script. They've done away with the Confederate uniforms, but it's still, and in that case, that production functions locally as a debutante function for the girls in the court. So there are these two productions happening sort of simultaneously. And so they are still grappling with how to view their past and how to depict their past. Yeah.
Well, I know we want to leave time for audience questions,
Sure.
So I would just like to ask you one more thing.
Absolutely.
Which is about the ending of your book. You end with a message to young white Southern women, and you really give them a charge.
I do.
Would you like to share with all of us what you want young white Southern women to be thinking about?
Sure. I would love to. I'll just read it.
Okay.
Performance matters. Renovating the landscape of white Southern remembrance will require more than removing monuments and renaming schools and streets. It will mean new motions and gestures, new rituals and productions. It will mean shuttering or rewriting the feminine performances central to white Southern nostalgia. A shared Southern future requires a reconciled past, and that will take radical honesty on the part of all white Southerners, but especially young women. What sort of trauma has their frivolity obscured? The power is theirs to alter the performance, share the memory, and change the South.
Thank you.
And I would say, and their moms.
Well, I don't know if members of the audience here at Charis have questions, or if there are any questions coming in online.
Yeah, we actually have several virtual questions. We can start out with our friend Robin here, in person.
Hi, it's so good to see you in real life, not just on Twitter. How
Nice
are
to meet you.
I've been thinking a lot as you were talking about the language used and talking about the girls and sororities. And just a couple of weeks ago, someone called Agnes Scott a girls' school to me, and I think all of us at Agnes Scott will correct them and say we're a historically women's college, or also saying predominantly women's college to say that we're not only women. So could you talk about this language of girls and ladies and women? Like all of these are so charged, and when are they changing? When does a girl become a woman in this world, or when does a girl become a lady? All of these
Yeah.
terms.
So I didn't read from this passage, but in my book, I note that in the chapter on sorority rush, they refer to each other as girls, of course. So, and I point that out. All of these young women are on the brink of womanhood, certainly. I mean, I would say they're already young women. They're in college. And yet they don't always see themselves as that mature or adult. So I think it's part of it is their own perception of themselves in terms of the terminology that they use. When do they become women? I don't know. I guess it's when they consider themselves women. Yeah. So there's a lot of
getting married to be a woman.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't get that far.
Yeah.
But there is a real within the sorority system that I study, there's a real heteronormativity and lots of activities that go along with that emphasis in that system, for sure. With this romantic goal of meeting the right man, being part of what they're expecting from this sort of golden time of being in school.
One of our sort of unique experiences being a feminist bookstore in the South is that we receive a lot of white women who are outcast within Southern white femininity, right?
Because they didn't play the game or they
Right. And particularly
rejected it.
Yeah, you're talking about this moment, 2015, 2016, 2017, so Charleston and then Trump and then really the Me Too movement. We saw this huge influx of white women who left their churches, left their patriarchal family units, mostly heterosexual, otherwise like very gender normative white women from Christian backgrounds who wanted to be of use to movements, but had not, and knew that they were not like those other women, but only knew how to position themselves in sort of an oppositional way to the bad sorority women, essentially, right? But had no constructive identity to create and couldn't figure out how to be of use without taking up space in a way that was negative in that time, right? There was so much conversation about white women's tears and things like that because there really was not like going online and being a hot mess online was not a great thing to do at that moment when Black people and people of color were grieving about police violence and all these other things. But there was this lane that Charis received. It was just like all of these women who were like, I don't know what to do. I'm not that, but I also am not healed, right? And so I'm just wondering about this other group of white women who feel so wounded by that form of femininity, but are not, super gender non-conforming. They're still heterosexual Christian white women that just are like, I don't know where I fit.
Where am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do?
Yeah, and how do I renounce that without being terrible to those women? And how do I move in a way that is of use to change the world? Sort of your final call to action.
Well, that is so interesting, and that's why I highlight that moment between the murders in Charleston and George Floyd's murder and what happens in Charlottesville, because up until that time, in my book, I talk about the time of massive resistance and these young women, passive resistance in the mid 20th century. But part of what I'm looking at is in the later decades, the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, when overt racism had become untenable. That's not something you did. That's another thing that you were silent about if that was your sentiment. But it just kind of got tamped down. It didn't go away. And the desire to still enjoy that white privilege, the gender privilege, the esteem, the adulation was still there. And so I think it wasn't until this volatile moment when people were forced to really look back at the past and, admit, it's kind of strange for historians, admit what the Civil War was really about and what the role of this feminine construct had been used for all those decades, right? And I think that was, it was definitely a wake-up call because, for so many decades that, from the 70s onward, after the Civil Rights Movement, there became this sort of agree to disagree, but not to talk about it. Again, not discuss. Heritage, not hate was a catchword for a long time. And it kept people, again, not knowing, not discussing, just sort of dissembling on the whole issue. And I think that this is where, white women for sure had to admit what that feminine ideal had done, what role it had played in Southern history, and what their complicity with it was. So, are you part of the problem or are you part of the solution? Yeah.
Z. McThomas asks, during your research, did you engage with Blair Roberts' pageants, parlors, and pretty women, race and beauty in the 20th century South, and her analysis of Southern white women's beauty pageants and rituals? Also, your book sounds amazing, and I will be purchasing.
Oh, nice. So Blair and I kind of went back and forth on being readers for each other's work. I was a reader for her early Southern Cultures piece on Harvest Queens, and she was one of the readers on my manuscript. She certainly fleshed out an idea that I had in my dissertation about this role of sort of mid-20th century queens on campuses, this what I call passive resistance, but fleshed that idea out. So we've kind of gone back and forth, and certainly that's a wonderful study. Yeah.
Do any of our folks in here have a question?
Hi, thank you so much for your work. This has been really fascinating.
Thanks for
My name is Becca. I'm currently in training to be a psychologist. My interest in body image and eating disorders, especially for women of color. I'm not from the South, but I've been here for long enough. I'm, gonna be here for a little bit longer. And I work with a lot of women from the South. I guess I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about non-white and non-Black women's kind of interactions with these conversations. I know that the South does have a very Black and white history. I understand that, but again, I'm just kind of curious to know, like, in some of these spaces, if you've heard other stories from women who are not in either of those two groups, and like how their femininity is being formed by all of this.
I'm sorry, what's the last part?
How their femininity is being formed by all of these conversations.
Well, they're not the focus of my research. I've read some things about them, but I wouldn't say that was a big part of my study. I would think it would be difficult to operate without, having it have an impact on you. Trying to think what other, you're saying non-Black and non-white, so other, that was not a big part of my study.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are some things that you might find of interest in the epilogue of my book, which kind of updates some of these productions. And I'm thinking about some quotes from another book called Girl Culture, of a photographer who is at the Chattanooga Cotton Ball, which is a big debutante function. And a young Asian woman, or a young woman is being interviewed, and she says, "Yeah, that's a big thing at these things. There's mostly white girls at this thing. Maybe one Asian, one black girl. The Southern accent really comes out at these types of things." So it's this, but yeah, so they're kind of pointing out the marginalization of other people participating.
I think that's super important as both Alabama and Mississippi and certainly Georgia become increasingly diverse in terms of non-black people of color. It's like,
Right.
University of Mississippi, and it's definitely that those demographics have changed so much. It will be interesting to see. So we have a question from Laura Headley. Laura says the power of nostalgia is an overarching theme throughout your book, and especially the critical role of women as keepers and perpetuators of memory. Could you speak about the role of the performances in your book, Rush, Beauty Pageants, Natchez, Confederate Pageant, in fueling nostalgia for particular versions of the Old South?
Well, that's what my book is about.
The whole thing.
Yeah, but certainly I'm thinking about in Natchez, there's this, from early on, that pageant started in the 1930s, 1931, 32, and continued for 82 years before having a significant rewrite. And it really appealed to tourists who really wanted to come and sort of consume and that affect, feeling Southern. They wanted to come, they wanted to see the old houses, they wanted to see the hoop skirts, they wanted to experience sort of unchanged social relations, and they do. This is part of what Natchez is selling. And in the early years, during segregation, this was just good business. But it increasingly become, after the civil rights movement, becomes increasingly problematic that this is still being predicted. The production is still depicting this fantasy land South, and the young women are still sort of upholding the social structure by performing these very specific roles in this production, in these old costumes, and they eventually sort of paint themselves into a representational corner, and it comes to a head. But it's very, very late. It's like for 70s, 80s, 90s, everybody's still just fine with it. There was no crisis of interpretation. So there's still a lot of that going on, and they haven't figured out or haven't agreed upon how to move forward in a way that either just retires the whole production. There's no particular reason to have it except that it serves as this debutante function. It doesn't make any money. It requires on volunteers. So to me, that says that it's really a production for themselves, right? It's doing some cultural work there in the city that's for each other. It's not really a big booming tourist business.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the role of Christianity and Christian nationalism in all of this.
Wow, I'm not sure I can. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I just paying my dues in Ole Miss. I felt like it was the whiteness was inextricable from a certain version of Christianity, and like Jewish girls were also excluded from clubs still into the 20s.
That's exactly right.
So I mean, Jewish girls were racialized in a way that I had never experienced coming from Atlanta, and certainly atheists were not racialized, but white atheists were as foreign as could be, and so to me that brand of whiteness felt so particularly Protestant. And
yes, and I actually talk about that in the sorority section, because there is this assumption that you're Christian. some of these scripts in the skits that the girls use during Rush have a Christian theme. Some of the ritual is Christian, and there is that assumption. So that is difficult to eradicate.
Well, there is no Southern lady without her Southern gentleman, and I'd be interested to hear about how the women you studied dealt with problems of rape and toxic masculinity within fraternities at their universities. And especially among the men who they're interacting with, their sororities or attending parties with, or
Well, that was not a topic that we discussed. Of course, I know from many other studies that's it's proven that young women who are part of that Greek system are much more likely to experience sexual assault. Whether there's a Southern lady without a Southern gentleman, well, that counterpart, is ostensibly necessary, but in Natchez, it's interesting to me because the women run the town, they save that town, and run the entire, it's a tourism, multi-million-dollar tourism business that they created, and that they perpetuate through their tour, keeping the homes up and touring the homes. But you're correct. There is an insistence when they go to this production that the president of the garden club have a male escort. And that, of course, the entire court scene is very heteronormative, and there's pairing off one by one. But it's sort of a fiction in terms of the business history of that city, because the women did it all, but they made it appear as if they were conforming to gender norms. So it's kind of fascinating.
Just anecdotally, when I taught at Ole Miss in the early 2000s, I was one of the only people who visibly identified as a feminist and as a queer person. And after the first semester I taught there, word got out that I was a feminist, and I had young women showing up at my door asking about going to Planned Parenthood, asking about domestic violence resources. Did I think they were going to go to hell if they had an abortion? I mean, girls who did not know me from Adam come in because they were like, you said you're a feminist, you're the only person I know on this campus that uses that word that in a way that is not a slur. So I think there's a huge amount of underground, again, this was a long time ago, this was almost 20 years ago, but there was not conversation about it when I was there. And that was after the turn of the millennium, so.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in what you have to say about the beauty pageant as this kind of, having its roots in the Confederate memorial. Do you have any reflection on the growth of sort of eugenics baby contests and the relationship between the eugenic?
I think actually Blaine Roberts writes about that. But the Better Baby movement and those pageants. Yeah, I purposely limited. I have a couple of mentions and a photograph of some of the young girls pageants, but I necessarily sort of focused my manuscript on this particular age range because it was capable of answering the questions I had. I had any number of people along the way suggest to me, oh, you really need to make it comparative with Black women's sororities and the Divine Nine and this, that, the other. And I would smile and nod. But ultimately, the questions I had were about these white women's productions. What was the import of them? And so, I mean, I know a lot about the Black sororities, but that was not the intent of my project.
So we're gonna close out with this question. Do you think there is a space for Greek life in a feminist anti-racist future?
Ooh, say that again, that
Do-
space?
Do you think there is a space for Greek life in a feminist anti-racist future?
I think there could be. I think currently, as they're structured and sort of operate today, they give far too much power to these fraternity men to determine their social life, when it should be the other way around. There's not to say, that they could not have a change of purpose, but they would need to change, and I talk about this, they would need to change sort of their yardsticks for recruitment and ditch this bell aesthetic as a goal. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for being with us tonight. Thank you to all of our friends watching virtually at home. You can click this teal button at the bottom of your screen to buy Southern Beauty, Race, Ritual, and Memory in the Modern South from Charis. It really does help us when you buy your event books from us. So